thank you all for joining us for this month's installment of Wild at Work, a Stewardship series. Go ahead and get rolling. So today we have Mr. Will Newman joining us. As a Farm Bill Coordinator, Will Newman serves as the liaison for Texas Parks and Wildlife Department to the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Prior to his current role, Will was a quail biologist in South Texas, a Farm Bill biologist in Ohio, and has conducted grassland ecology and quail research at Tarleton State and the University of North Texas. He has co-authored research and technical publications on grassland bird behavior and habitat requirements and habitat management through planned grazing. We thank you, Will, for taking the time to be here today. Before I hand the reins off to you, I want to just let all of our participants know that you will have to remain muted and on with your camera off throughout the entirety of the presentation. If you have any questions for Will, you can use the chat feature on Zoom, and we'll keep track of those throughout the presentation and give Will an opportunity to answer those at the end. For all of those who are joining us online after this presentation is over, if you'd like to be able to ask questions to the host yourself, then please join us next time live and in person. Well, with that, I'll go ahead and stop sharing and hand the reins over to you.
All right. Let me make sure we get this pulled up correctly. How's it look, Jared? Can you see everything?
Yeah, sure can.
All right. Thanks, guys. I'm excited to be here today. Like Jared said, I'm the Farm Bill Coordinator, and I'm the liaison to USDA. And but in my background, I'm a grassland ecologist and a quail guy. And so a lot of what we're going to talk about today is through that lens. That's tends to be how I think about things. But along the way, we're going to talk about specifics about grazing and habitat, and then programs and agencies and partners. And it's a lot of information. And so I encourage folks, if you're interested, I have my contact information here on the screen now, and then again at the end. And I'm a good point of contact, a resource for TWA membership. Y'all can reach out to me, and I can help you answer some questions or get in contact with folks that I'm going to talk about today. It's a bit like drinking from a fire hose. It's a lot of information. I expect there to be questions and follow-up if you hear something that applies to you. So with that, so again, I'm a quail biologist. I tend to think of things from the perspective of a quail. And when I think about habitat, I'm thinking about our grassland ecosystems in Texas, and where much of the state, if not all of it, was really good bobwhite quail habitat historically, and can be when appropriate management and land use decisions are applied. So the first thing we need to do is talk about what habitat is. In Texas, because most of the state was historically grassland, that ecosystem provided habitat for a high diversity of wildlife. These grassland systems were primarily influenced by cycles of disturbance from naturally occurring seasonal fires and herbivory or grazing from wildlife species. These factors were not rare or inconsequential. They were not independent of one another. They depended on each other. The grazing and the fire behavior influenced each other and the rest of the ecosystem. They were not things that happened to the ecosystem. They were a critical and formative part of what makes a grassland, especially in Texas. So when we're talking about grazing and the impacts of grazing on wildlife habitat, grazing is a critical part of what the ecosystem should be. We need to have grazing. So what are some of our limits to wildlife habitat? Notably, land use and management decisions dictate what we see on the ground. Plant communities, so the plants that are on the landscape, make up the backbone of any ecosystem. It's the basis of the food chain. It provides all of the needs for the various wildlife that occupy a certain ecosystem. And so our decisions about on issues that affect that plant community dictate the outcomes for the ecosystem. So if our decisions decrease the native plant community in some way, we may be decreasing the quality, the size of the habitat that's available for certain wildlife species, but we're also creating areas of unusable space within that habitat, and that causes fragmentation as the patches of suitable habitat for a specific species may be moved apart from each other so that the population can't intermingle or influence itself. So here's a hard truth, and that's that most ecosystems on the planet have been altered by modern humans and will now require our management to continue to function in some way. Ecosystems evolve not only under restraints of the climate and local topography or elevation, but are also defined by specific historic disturbances. Again, for rangeland, land use is still compatible with grassland cover, but modern humans have removed or greatly restricted the two most important disturbances to those plant communities, and that's the impact of migratory or unconfined, unfenced grazing and wide-ranging seasonal fire that occurred on the landscape. And these things have been replaced with fences and fire suppression. These are great for good, healthy relationships with our neighbors, but without those system-dependent disturbances, healthy and diverse grasslands can't persist without some human intervention. If you add in the planting of exotic pasture grasses, the result for our grasslands is good ground cover that could be made up of grass, but that is non-functional because of a lack of diversity and no longer really a grassland ecosystem. These non-functional ecosystems can create reduced habitat quality, degraded habitat quality, and increased fragmentation, spread those populations out. And all of those things lead to instability in wildlife populations. Restoration of altered rangelands can be as simple as implementing a compatible grazing system and returning periodic fire to the landscape through prescribed fire. These extensive practices are wide-ranging, but not terribly intense or expensive. And these things can nudge a plant community back in the right direction and stabilize those grassland ecosystems that restore the integrity and the output of those systems. So this is a good place to mention that these management decisions or land use decisions occur on a spectrum that range from being compatible with a native ecosystem to being destructive or incompatible with a native ecosystem and therefore wildlife habitat that should occupy that place. More compatible systems tend to mimic the natural disturbances, and these tend to also be lower input and provide a lot of output in various types of resources. Less compatible tend to be really intense with their inputs, but also may have high productivity for agricultural production. But that production is done through the extraction of those natural resources and can be eliminate the output of things like wildlife habitat. The appropriate application of grazing can be determined by the local soil and climate circumstances as a baseline, and that baseline should be considered to determine what your appropriate production goals might be. All right, let's see. So if we're going to talk about grazing, we should define a couple of terms up front so that we're all speaking the same language. Some terms like pasture can have a lot of different meanings to different folks. And so I want to be clear about what I'm talking about when I use these terms. So in this case, pasture or hayland or hay ground is land that's been converted from the native ecosystem into a production operation. It's farming of forage for livestock. This could either be grazed pasture or it could be harvested as hay or both. but these tend to be a monoculture or otherwise very low diversity compared to the natural system. And they require high inputs, a lot of management with herbicides and fertilizers and reseeding, other types of inputs that cost money in order to get a high output out of that system. They can be very productive, provide a lot of forage for wildlife, and they certainly have a place in the agricultural landscape. It's important for us to produce. These systems are important for us to produce the amount of food and fiber that we need as a nation. So no moral judgments about anything that we say. This is just, as a matter of fact, here's what we get when we choose to do this type of land use. Rangeland, on the other hand, harnesses the productivity of a native plant community and harvests the surplus production of the plant material. And that's grazed directly by livestock. These are typically not managed intensely with pesticides or fertilizers and things of that sort. And if managed appropriately, should be very low inputs, but maybe less output than we would have on a more intense system. There is a harvestable surplus, and it's fully possible to have a productive agricultural enterprise using only the surplus production of native rangeland. So native rangeland can be great wildlife habitat, and the emphasis on can because we can abuse it, or we can use rangeland in a way that is not compatible with wildlife habitat outcomes. Pasture and hayland is a little harder to draw a direct line to wildlife habitat. Certainly some wildlife will use improved pasture or hayland, but not continuously. It's not going to provide the full spectrum of needs that wildlife need year round. And the number of species that can utilize that type of land use is greatly reduced from the native ecosystem. So it's important for us to be honest about where we're starting from. What do we have? You know, if you currently have native rangeland that's managed really well, then this is going to be an easy presentation to digest. If you're looking at a situation where you have a lot of converted pasture land that's an introduced species with low diversity, you may see some challenges if your goal is genuinely to have more wildlife or stable ecosystems. So we may have more work ahead of us if that's the case. We just need to be honest about where we're at. No moral judgments. Successful management requires intentional and informed decision making. That is the biggest takeaway that I encourage folks to have here from this presentation and the information I'm going to give out, is that there are resources available. Use those resources to make informed decisions and to set realistic goals about what you can accomplish depending on what those goals are. So let's jump right into it. So a good way to look at this is, we look at the left side of this infographic from Oklahoma and North Texas. We can see a good demonstration of what our native rangeland might look like over on the left, over here on the left. And so this is a diverse plant community, mostly made up of grasses and forbs or weeds and wildflowers. And this high diversity supports a whole ecosystem of insects and arthropods and vertebrates that use each of those plants specifically. As a stable ecosystem over time. It is influenced by grazing and periodic fire to keep woody plants out of that system from dominating that system, but also it's stable in that cycle. So long-lived herbaceous plants can be the dominant plants here. And because grazing is an evolved part of that system, we can productively graze rangeland in this condition. It's very productive, high nutrition, lots of protein in the grasses, as long as we don't overgraze. The moment that we exceed the surplus production of this plant community, we start to give a competitive advantage to other less desirable species that are outside of the normal stabilized native plant community. These could be annual plants or weeds. It can be exotics or invasive plants, but we're creating a disadvantage by harvesting more of the native plant community than is sustainable. And so for most wildlife species, most native wildlife species, we want to be somewhere over here on the left-hand side of this graph. Down here at the bottom, we see a couple of visualizations of what we're looking at here. So it's really easy to maintain this condition as long as we're not overutilizing it. All we have to do is manage the grazing, see what's happening out there, make tweaks to the plan, and keep it in this condition. Maybe this is just modifications to the grazing plan over time. Maybe it's a periodic implementation of prescribed fire just to freshen it up and keep us over here. But we're talking about low inputs, just management decisions. As we progress to the right on this graph, we're starting to react to conditions instead of proactively determining what's on the landscape. These reactive management decisions are fully acceptable. We can still have really productive grazing habitat, grazing and production and wildlife habitat anywhere on this left-hand side. But as we move into this towards the middle, we're reacting more than we're planning. And we're running a risk that if we experience drought or other conditions that set back our forage base, that more and more overgrazing is going to occur, and it sort of spirals into a negative condition. As we move down this slope, we move further and further away from the native ecosystem, and it requires more and more effort to push that ball back uphill and over the hump to get us back into a stable situation. Once we get over to the right-hand side, we're really talking about restorative actions. As the native perennial grasses make way for annual plants that sort of take over our lower nutritional value, the animals eat more of it, and it just spirals into a forage loss. But it also opens up competitive spaces for undesirable plants. Imagine mesquite trees or annual broomweed that dominate when overgrazing or high impact occurs. And these plant community trends towards storing all of its energy in woody, long-lived plants that are also really difficult for us to manage and remove in order to restore us back to a native ecosystem. So another way to look at this is your forage production capacity. So if our native ecosystem production includes a certain stocking rate, our native grasslands would have been up to 94% grass or grass-like plants. That's our forage base. That's what our cows want to eat. So we got a high percentage of that landscape in forage production. But as we overgraze it, we get more forbs and more woody plants and vines and shrubs. And so our ability to produce more forage begins to reduce as we move to the right. And if we move too far to the right, we greatly reduce the forage production capacity on our landscape. And it costs more. We got to do more intense restoration in order to restore that forage production capacity, as well as the ecosystem function and wildlife habitat. So again, it's a choice, a management and land use decision-making choice here to graze at a level that degrades your ability to produce future forage, but also reduces the capacity for wildlife habitat. So these are both valid choices. On the top, we have a lot of forage and a few cows, healthy cows. On the bottom, we still have healthy cows. This is a production choice. But on the bottom, the choice is that we've chosen not to produce some of those ecosystem services, and we've chosen not to prioritize wildlife habitat, and we're choosing to spend more resources to ensure future production. We're not reliant on the natural surplus anymore. We're having to put a lot of inputs in to continue to be productive on the land. So another way to look at that is on the left here, we're choosing to produce some grazing, but also choosing wildlife habitat and more productive wildlife habitat that's in sync and compatible with the native ecosystem. On the right, we have taken a deviation from normal plant succession. We've created a situation where The land is dominated by one or a few species that provide limited use for wildlife and reduced forage production capacity for our livestock. So if we're going to talk about the business of grazing management and how that influences wildlife, we have to understand a few things about grazing management. And so let's talk for just a minute about forage utilization and how the grasses grow. We need to understand that to understand how we can plan to use those grasses in a way that's sustainable. So our above ground mass of any plant is made up by the leaves. And the leaves are the factory for energy storage on the plant. And that energy is used to produce more leaves and grow more up to a certain point. And at a certain point, the leaves stop growing and it starts storing all of its resources in the roots before trying to reproduce with a seed head. If we graze, we remove some of that plant material, the leaf material at the top. And up to a certain point, because our native grasses are evolved in an ecosystem where grazing and fire took place, there is a certain capacity for these plants to remove leaf material without even affecting the plant in any negative way. In fact, I would say that most grasses on our grasslands require some influence from grazing in order to stimulate further growth and to invigorate that plant. And so grazing is good for it up to a certain point. But once we remove more than 50% of the above ground leaf material, notice I didn't say eat 50%, but remove 50%, then we start to impact the roots and the ability of the plant to sustainably react to those grazing conditions or drought and to continue its life cycle. As the roots reduce, the plant turns back into a different urgency to grow more leaves at the cost of the roots that stabilize the life cycle of that plant. And so what we do is we cause it to take more time for the plant to recover, the more you overgraze. And also we increase the stress on that plant so that it's slower to react to restorative time and conditions, and it's more susceptible to drought. So a basic tenet here of forage utilization is take half, leave half. But there's a little bit more to that than just those words. Half doesn't mean we get to consume or graze half of the above plant. And half means the biomass, the weight of the material, not the height of the plant. So both of those things are really important and clarifications to that saying. You can assume that when we're grazing a forage, not cutting it for hay, but grazing the forage, we are likely to lose about 25% of that above ground material to trampling, and the cow pulls it off the plant and then drops it, but it doesn't get inside the cow. And so we're really only consuming about 25% of the standing material. It's important when we start to make a plan to sustainably graze. We need to know how much food is getting into the cow to understand how many cows we can put on a pasture. I'm going to try to turn off my video. Maybe. Okay, so this planning is what we would refer to as adaptive grazing. And a lot of these slides and these descriptions I'm borrowing from a friend with USDA, Matt Mahachek. He's a grazing specialist down near Victoria. So concept number one, avoid eating too much of the grass. Avoid overgrazing. We can avoid negative impacts of those roots. Number two is recovery. Rest and recovery get conflated a little bit sometimes. Recovery only occurs over time, but only during time when the plant is growing. So if we graze all the way up until the winter on native warm season summer growing grasses, the winter time does not count as recovery. The plant's not growing and restoring its root system when it's too cold for that plant to grow. So rest and recovery has to occur during the growing season. Timing is really important. That's timing on when we graze a plant and timing for when the recovery takes place as well. Productivity of the plant is at its highest, the nutritional value is at its highest when the plant is growing during that time of the year. It's important to plan and make adaptive changes to our plan based on the current environmental conditions. We can have drought, floods, other extremes in temperature that change the growth rate that we thought we would expect in a certain growing season. And so the changes the growth and recovery of those plants, and our plan needs to be able to account for those changes. Number 5, animals don't use the landscape evenly. If it's too steep, if there's too much brush, if the rock surface is really rocky, animals will avoid those areas and focus more of their grazing impact on areas that are flatter and more soil, and where the plants they like to graze are growing and are readily available. So our grazing impacts on the landscape are not even. The ability of an animal to meet its nutritional requirements depends on the quality and quantity of the forage. Well, our native grasses are growing most intensely and have the highest nutritional value in the summertime, and that's when we want to plan our herd plan for our grazing animals so that their nutritional requirements line up with when the most nutritious forage is available. If we plan to do our pregnant cows and to have nursing during the optimal grazing production period of the summer, that's when the most nutrition is going to be available. And then later in the year, when these plants start to go dormant, they still have nutritional value, but it's closer to the maintenance for nutritional requirements for our livestock than something we would want to rely on for those intense nutritional requirement periods of the life cycle of our animals. Concept 7. If you increase the number of paddocks or rotate faster through a system, you may or may not affect the plant selection. And plant selection is going to determine how diverse and dense the density and diversity of the plant community. Number 8. If you use more of the pasture, you can graze more animals sometimes. I don't want to get too hung up on that. I don't necessarily want to advocate for high intensity, fast rotation grazing. It's really productive. It can be a good way to manage your forage resources, but maybe not the structure or diversity of the plant community that would be beneficial for wildlife habitat. So what does success look like? Typically, we like to say green and brown year round. That means we have some old growth vegetation out there and a lot of fresh green growth. If in the spring your rangeland looks like a freshly planted oat field and it's fresh and green and all the same height, that's a bad sign if you're managing for rangeland. It typically indicates overgrazing the year before. This also doesn't leave a lot for wildlife habitat. If we look specifically for bobwhite quail, we want to ideally manage so that there's some old growth, tall bunch grasses that are left over from the year before, and in order to provide the nesting cover that those quail need early in the spring. And as that forage really starts to grow, we can graze it a little more heavily and rotate our cattle through there without having a negative impact on the bobwhite. And we would call that grazing around the life cycle of the animal that we're managing for. Another aspect of adaptive planning is contingency planning. If you don't have a plan for negative things to come, then you're really planning to fail. And so we want to have a plan. What do we do if conditions are not as we planned for? And you need to be ready to make tough decisions. And the folks that are able to make these decisions improve their sustainability and the stability of their operation over time. So let's talk about business. So this graph here shows a business sort of output and inputs, what we would typically expect. So if we had a factory and we were making devices to sell in the market. Our productivity wouldn't begin until we make an initial investment. It costs some money to get started. But as we start producing our product, it takes less and less additional investment until we reach a point where we've broken even, where our investment now is producing more surplus production than what it costs to make it. And so this green part and the distance between the top line of what we make and the bottom line of what it costs to make it, this is our profit margin. And so as we input more resources, we can produce more outcomes. And it just continues infinitely. As long as we got warehouse or factory space, we can keep pumping resources in and keep making more of our product. But if we were to consider that a grazing operation on native rangeland looks more like this, certainly down here we have to make an initial investment and we have to start our production. And at a certain point, we hit a break even where we start to make money. And as we add more resources, more animals to the landscape, at a certain point, we're maximizing our margin of profit. But if we keep putting more animals on the landscape, at a certain point, we run out of forage. And those resources and the forage that's available in the landscape begin to decline, and it starts costing us more money for every animal that's on the landscape above the surplus. So this management or lack of planning, if we allow ourselves to get over here, it can cost us money. And then once it starts costing us money, we got to take intense action like restorative actions, and our future ability to graze and produce forage into the future is declined as well. But what if there's a way to pad our profit margins? If we are grazing in sync with the native ecosystem, we start to produce really good wildlife habitat. Aesthetic values, intrinsic value gets added to our profit. And so if you're a private landowner with a ranching operation, you certainly need a certain amount of profit to come out of your grazing operation. But that's not the only factor that should be considered when you're making those management decisions. If you like to have wildlife, if you prefer how it looks when you have native rangeland with a diversity of wildflowers and plants rather than a monoculture of pasture, then you may choose that to assign value in addition to the monetary output of your ag production. Not to mention that wildlife habitat, especially for hunting and other recreational uses, can carry an economic value as well. So as a whole, I want us thinking about good grazing management as being in line with the native ecosystem and sustainably using the surplus production of those plants so that we can continue to do that indefinitely and produce the outcomes that are compatible with wildlife habitat. Anything more than that would be poor grazing management in the context of sustainability or wildlife habitat. So what happens when there isn't a plan? Executing a realistic plan is the key here. Often, if there's no plan or a risky plan, any hardship could result in costly, to be costly in terms of economics, your habitat quality, your future forage production, and time to recover that. So where do we start? On a grazing management plan, we need information. We need to understand the things that go into how much forage we can produce. And there are tools and resources available, most of them provided by the USDA and some of our partners, including this one is the Web Soil Survey. I just wanted to throw this up here. We can map out your paddocks and figure out what soil type and how much plant or vegetative productivity you can have on those acres. And that information can be fed into a stocking rate table to figure out how many animal units you can put on those particular acres. And it can help us kind of narrow down what is an appropriate stocking level. Now, this is all hypothetical. This is what we should be able to produce. And it's a starting point for a plan. And I would advocate for an adaptive plan that makes changes as we learn more information. part of this, once we have that information about what's hypothetically possible, we want to evaluate the real world scenario that we're looking at. If we have our total acreage is not our total grazable acres, things like the density of brush, the rockiness of the soil or the slope, or the certainly the acres lost to roads or other infrastructure on your ranch aren't grazable acres. And we need to account for that when we make a grazing management plan. Another part is the timing of the grazing. We want to build in the ability to rest and recover those plants that have been grazed so that we can graze them again productively and continue to harvest surplus. Usually that's done by rotations or moving the grazing pressure around. And there are lots of ways to do that, not just with fences, but with water or fire. We can move grazing pressure around the landscape. Lots of ways to accomplish that. But if you're unable to account for rotations or the movement of cattle, if that investment of time and effort is not part of your plan or capability, then we need to plan to reduce the stocking rate so that we're looking at a continuous grazing system that's very lightly stocked. And then we can conservatively start there and add animals up into the point where we can adjust that stocking rate up or down depending on the conditions. Plans are a starting place. You have to change them depending on the current conditions, which means you have to go observe what's happening on the landscape. And again, plans without a contingency are a plan to overgraze that will result in some failure. So here's a common situation. We had good conditions. We stocked heavily, then we hit a drought. The animals eat more than what is sustainable on the landscape, and now we have an overgrazed situation. What do we do? And how do we prevent that from happening again? Well, I would contend that if we're constantly overgrazing, then you're always going to be in a drought condition. The ability for the plants to recover is reduced over time the more you overgraze. And so you're likely to see drought-like conditions even with some appreciable rainfall. So our priorities need to shift. Once overgrazing is occurring or we're in a drought and it's causing us to move away from our planned conditions, then we need to prioritize preventing soil loss or plant degradation. We need to protect our capacity, our ability to grow more forage next year. And we just need to prepare for the rain. And that means making some hard decisions about destocking in some cases. So we talk about drought. If we write a management plan and we plan to graze at 100% of the capacity of what that forage production is on the landscape, we need to know, is that in an average rainfall year, a drought year, or an above average year? And I would contend that being more conservative on that decision making is the way to go if you want to sustain your operation over time. Even if we stock at 100% forage production capacity at 25% below the average rainfall, you're still 15% of the time you're going to have an extreme drought or something that causes us to have to change our plan. If you stock at the average, you're only going to hit that forage production goal before you start to degrade your resources half of the time. So I don't like advertising or advocating for stocking at the average rainfall. You want to expect poor conditions, and in that situation, you can always add a few more cows if you have a lot of forage production, but you need to be ready to get rid of them. If we stock aggressively all the time, it's going to burn you. You're only going to be meeting your forage production only 17% of the time. We like this quote, the man who has a short pasture needs rain much worse than his neighbor who has ample forage on the range. But when the range comes, it does the least good for the fellow who needs it the most. As we degrade those plants and they have less roots under the soil, their ability to capture and utilize that rainfall is decreased. So it takes more rain over more time to get recovery. And here's a good example of that. Over on the left is a producer that we work with that is the first one out, the last one in. You can see the soil texture difference. These two pastures are next to each other. the soil temperature on the surface during the drought was considerably different. And the soil compaction that occurs over here on the neighbor on the right is significant, and it reduces the ability of the plants to respond. And here's what we got once we got a measurable rainfall. The guy on the left got very quick recovery because he left the plants in a condition to maximize their utilization of that rain. The guy on the left got very little recovery. If we look at some math, what happens if we put 100% capacity at 50 cows on a paddock versus bumping it up another a little bit more to 75 cows? That means we're going to end up having to feed them hay. And during that time, I would challenge you to look at this. Now, some of the specific numbers here are hypothetical or just pulled, may vary depending on where you're at or the gear that we're talking about. But the example would hold true here. We're getting very little return for adding 25 cows because we're going to spend a lot more on resources and management actions and hay in order to feed those 25 extra cows. The guy on the left is going to end up making more profit on his bottom line than the guy on the left that spent more to make a little bit more. As we're talking about hay is a contingency and not a grazing plan. So if part of your plan is to have to feed hay for a portion of the year, then you're already spending more money than you probably need to. And you may consider in a lot of situations simply reducing the number of livestock that you have on those acres for the full 12 months of the year can reduce your dependency on hay. Certainly, we need hay on the landscape. We need to be able to use it in those lean and drought years. We need to be able to have that as part of our contingency plan to meet the nutritional requirements of our livestock, to keep us from having to destock every year. But it shouldn't be a normal part of your plan. It's just a contingency. So if we go back to those tools and we're ready to start making our plan, we want to use things like the web soil survey or local expertise on your soil types to figure out how much plant productivity we can expect for your soil. And we can input some of that information to really find out some more information. So within web soil survey, we can figure out in your area, what do your soils typically look like? What should they look like according to the historic plant community that's there? You'll see some pictures. We'll see some diagrams that show us what it could be. And that natural historic plant community, the number one in the top left corner, is what it could look like. And that is the maximum ecosystem potential for the wildlife in your area. It's not going to be maximum forage production, but it is if you strive to land in this box up here and mimic that natural ecosystem and adjust your grazing accordingly, you're going to maximize your output for wildlife. This transition model shows us how we may have gotten to a fractured or deviated state, and then the actions and management that we can take to return us back to that natural ecosystem. It also shows us those forage production graphs, what type of plants would grow there, how much forage that is, and also some of the primary species that should be on your piece of land that you put in there. An evolution of that type of information now includes remote sensing data, so satellite images over time. And now we have 30, 40 years of really high quality satellite imagery, and we can put that information together in this tool called the range analysis platform. And so if you Google search range analysis platform, it'll pull up this website. You can go in and draw a polygon around your pasture or your whole ranch and determine some trends over time. And so once you process that data, it'll tell you what type of plants, how many pounds of production you had each year that it has satellite and rainfall data for. And we can use this, we can input some of our grazing management plan or goals to help simulate what we could expect on the landscape if you implemented those plans. Another cool thing as a side note that this tool can do is it can show us changes in the plant community. We could run a simulation that shows us over time a conversion to introduced grasses, or in this case, shows us the rate of encroachment for woody brush species. Over on the left, we have 1984, certainly woody canopy in East Texas and some brush through the center of the state. But if we compare that to the 2019 image, we can see how things have changed over time. As humans, we have a short-term memory. We really have a hard time seeing slow ecological processes, but these tools are giving us a way to give us a reference point and really look back in time and see how much things have changed. So what do we do with that information? Step one for me is figure out what your resources are and build a team of folks that can help you learn as much as possible. You use that information to set realistic goals according to the outcomes that you and your family desire for your land. And then you use those that team of folks to help you reach your goals. There's a number of programs available that can help you do that. Some of them provide technical guidance. Some of them provide financial assistance. Many of them do both things. And this team of folks that you're building can be made up of a lot of different professionals, and especially in the wildlife community, we have a lot of these resources available across the state. It's going to look different. There's different people, maybe different partnerships, but some of the most important ones that are uniform across the state. Texas Parks and Wildlife has a district biologist in every county, and that district biologist will be a local expert for your wildlife related goals. Some of them have more experience with ag production than others. They're more comfortable having a conversation about wildlife and your cattle grazing. Others may not be, but you'll take from them what they can provide to you and the input on the things that they're experts on. And then we build a team around that, starting with your NRCS, or Natural Resources Conservation Service. There'll be local conservation planners and district conservationists in an office in your county that can work with you and your Texas Parks and Wildlife biologist to help you build a comprehensive plan of how to manage your land to reach all of your goals. There are other partners from different organizations out there as well, and some of them are funded by USDA or Texas Parks and Wildlife to help increase our capacity to reach landowners and provide good wildlife habitat guidance. So let's talk for a minute about the Farm Bill. Quick review. The Farm Bill is a huge piece of national legislation. It's one of the most expensive things the federal government funds every year, and a good portion of that funding goes to conservation. These are farm subsidies, but also incentive programs that help landowners implement conservation practices on private lands. Is really important, and it gets re-evaluated and re-legislated every 4 to 5 years, and we're in the middle of that process right now. The Farm Bill creates a whole bunch of alphabet soup, and so this is like acronyms for names of agencies or programs, and we have to use those to understand what we're talking about, but don't get bogged down in the details here. Know where your resources, like myself, and reach out if you need help navigating this jumble of letters. Don't get overwhelmed by it. I'm going to breeze through some of these programs that are available. Don't feel like you have to absorb all of it in depth. Just know that these resources are available out there, and there's a lot of funding behind them. So probably the biggest tool in the toolbox is the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. And this is a Farm Bill program administered by the Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS. And in Texas, we spend more money on this program than any other state. We get the biggest piece of the pie by far. Typically, that's around $120 million that goes directly to private landowners in order to implement a planned conservation practice. There's a contract, a time of service for that particular practice, but they're paying you for the outcome of implementation of that practice. The sign-up period for the EQIP program is open right now for this year and is open until November 8th. Now, that's a pretty quick turnaround, but if you have some things that you want to get accomplished, This is any number of things. It's a really broad program, any number of conservation practices that you need to address resource concerns, whether it's wildlife or production-oriented concerns. Take this to your local NRCS office, start a conversation with them about how EQIP might be able to help you reach those goals. Within EQIP, it's a competitive process. So you put in an application for the program, and you'll be ranked and competitively scored against other applicants during that funding period, and you may or may not get funding based on the amount of resources available in your county. Historically, smaller or more focused wildlife-related projects tend to be ranked less competitively. So one of our biggest successes in our partnership with NRCS from Texas Parks and Wildlife is in the last year, we developed a dedicated funding pool for 10% of that EQIP spending to be dedicated for wildlife projects. So if we're spending about $120 million a year, you can do the math there. We're looking at more than $10 million a year dedicated for projects that do wildlife habitat. This is a list of some of those practices that might qualify. But the real takeaway here is that we have a landing place for applications and landowners that need these resources that are wanting to focus on wildlife projects. You're more competitive with a wildlife project now than you ever have been in the past. Part of EQIP would be the Working Lands for Wildlife initiative. And this initiative isn't its own project, but it is more of a marketing strategy and a training emphasis for NRCS and their partners to really bring all of their attention and resources to solve a wildlife problem. In Texas, we have a project focused on northern bobwhite quail. And so a lot of resources have been put behind this project to build capacity, and that has resulted in 3 partner positions across the state to help deliver EQIP funding specifically for bobwhite quail projects. So another big successful partnership with NRCS. The Regional Conservation Partnership Program sort of takes that idea further, where partners that are not funded by USDA can submit proposals for USDA to specifically target their funding at a resource concern. We have several of those across the state, and you may hear that term, RCPP, in discussion about resources that are available within a certain area. And this varies across the state on what partnership groups are operating where and what the details of their project are, but you may hear that term, and I'd want you to be familiar with it. But what this does is focuses the huge amount of resources from NRCS through the lens of a partnership's goals and delivers that to private landowners. So this may be another type of resources available to you. If you're looking at cropland, if you have acres that are in crop production out on the landscape, the Conservation Reserve Program may be the most lucrative program for you to be aware of. They pay a 10 to 15-year contract. They pay an annual rental payment for those acres, and they pay a huge amount of the cost share burden to convert those acres or restore those acres. In Texas, we also have special projects called SAFE projects, and these are wildlife focused projects, and we have 2 of those in the state, one for lesser prairie chickens, bobwhite quail, and other grassland birds, and one down in South Texas focused on ocelots, restoring retired cropland back to native grasslands and tommy and thorn scrub cover. But in the Panhandle, for that prairie safe project, we're focused on short and mid-grass prairie restoration, and this greatly benefits lesser prairie chickens and other grassland birds. And this program has been expanded in recent years to cover 71 different counties in the Panhandle and Western Rolling Plains. So if you have acres that are currently in crop production that you're considering bringing out of crop production and restoring to wildlife habitat, or in order to graze it in the future, this may be a really good option for you. You want to talk to your local farm service agency. They'll be in the same office as the NRCS within your county. A newer program is called Grassland CRP. The entirety of this project, it's statewide, it's available in every county. This map shows a high priority area for the Blackland Prairie counties in Texas, where these counties get a few extra points, but in the ranking process. But this is available statewide. Grassland CRP focuses on keeping grassland in grass. So the idea is to keep it from being broken out into cropland or converted to other types of production, or being converted or developed for residential or commercial property. And so this is a 10-year contract. They pay a minimum of $13 per acre. You're still allowed to hay or graze or continue your production. Projects that are proposed that have native grassland ecosystems intact are going to rank higher, and more of those will get funded, but any type of grass cover would apply for this program. Both Grassland CRP and the regular Conservation Reserve Program, they have sign-up periods that get announced. They aren't currently active right now, but we expect an announcement in the coming months for the 2024 funding cycle. Again, some of this is relying on that farm bill that's in legislation right now to get renewed, and a new version of that to be available to continue these programs. And then the holy grail is the easements programs. So locking down a conservation easement and providing perpetual protection for those acres to stay in their current condition is usually a really good way. It's some of the best investment of our conservation dollars on a broad scale. It may or may not fit in your goals or your operation, but it's something to be aware of, that USDA has these resources available. Going just a couple more here, Texas Parks and Wildlife delivers a program called the Landowner Incentive Program in partnership with the Partners for Fish and Wildlife Service program. We take some of their funding and some other funding streams and make available a habitat restoration program where our local biologists help the landowner develop a project proposal. And if they don't qualify for one of those other funding streams like EQIP, or they don't want to go through that process, they may be able to work with their local biologist to develop a landowner incentive program project and submit that for review. And depending on the amount of resources, we may be able to help accomplish those outcomes. Probably one of the most popular programs is the Pastures for Upland Birds program. This program focuses on retirement of cropland or improved pasture and converting it back to native plant communities, native grassland. This program works differently than others, where it's not an incentive payment or an exchange of funding. In this program, you work with your local biologist. You design a plan of where you want to convert, what acres you want to target. We help you figure out a seed mix that will work, and we provide the seed mix and the herbicide and all the technical guidance, and the landowner provides the labor or hires a contractor to do the planting and herbicide applications to conduct that restoration activity. It's a 10-year habitat retention to keep it in that cover and not build a subdivision or something on that acres, but you can graze it or hay it later after the establishment period is over. Very popular program. So all these programs are working to bring together all that technical guidance and come up with wildlife compatible solutions on an agricultural production landscape like we have here in Texas. There's a lot of ways to do that. Some tips there, again, involve your local biologist and your NRCS staff. Be honest about what your goals and priorities are, and make sure your plan is helping you get there. If you don't know what your goals should be, don't be afraid to ask the local professionals about what would be appropriate and how to best achieve those goals. Engage with your local soil and water conservation district. Engage with your local working groups for NRCS to help decide how local funding is spent, and take other landowners with you. And I'll wrap it up right there. Hopefully this presentation helps you understand some of those programs and navigate some decisions about grazing and wildlife habitat on your land. If you have questions, please reach out to me. Contact information is on the screen, and know that your local USDA service center can help you navigate these programs as well.